Welcome to the Second Studio, a design and architecture show hosted by two architects, myself, David Lee, and Marina Borderonnet. Today, it's just the two of us, and we are answering a question from a hotline text messenger, an architecture student asking how to best cope with learning remotely and attending architecture school remotely during the pandemic. They contacted us via our hotline, which is 213-222-6950. So anyone listening, if you have a follow-up question or anything else, you can reach us that way by either calling, and it will go straight to voicemail, or leaving a text message. We're supported by our friends at Naad, NAADME.com is the name of their website. They're an online retailer. They have a variety of home designer goods that they sell, curated from people who are from the Middle East and North Africa.
Designers.
Designers,
Emerging
right?
designers.
Emerging designers from North Africa. The emerging designers.
Emerging designers.
Such a fancy name, right?
They have amazing things.
Yeah.
So you should look it up, buy some good gift for people this year since you can spend Christmas with them. At least, send them some cool shit. Look at their stuff. They have jewelry, fashion, handbags, home goods. And if you use the code MIDNIGHT when you check out, you get 15% off.
Also, check out Study Architecture. Study Architecture is a website where students can find information on architecture programs to help them choose an undergraduate or graduate program that fits their needs. There's a list of over 100 summer architecture programs for students who are interested in developing their design skills over the summer. And Study Architecture is produced by the ACSA, the Association of Collegiate Schools of Architecture. This is the Second Studio with myself and Marina. Here we go. So from this person, hi, David and Marina. First off, I love your podcast and have been listening to it for more than a year. Question for both of you. How would you deal with starting architecture school in this time of remote learning?
Ooh.
As someone completely new to architecture, it has been a struggle to learn outside of the physical studio setting and connect with fellow classmates. I'm interested to hear your take on starting a program under such new circumstances. Thanks. My first thought is that's a very well-written little blurb from presumably a first-year student, and I'm going to assume is fresh out of high school. I don't know, maybe not.
Well, some people actually worked hard in high school, and therefore they are well spoken.
I worked hard in high school, but I could not write something like that.
Still
can't. Rude.
Okay. That's a very good question.
Yeah.
To be honest, it kind of sucks.
It's never good when you start with "to be honest." Let's hear it. Yeah.
To be honest, it kind of sucks that we just got this question now, almost in December, because I feel like if we did receive it much earlier, I would have told this person, if you can, defer a year. I feel like tuitions are not going cheaper, and people who enrolled in school, either they're stuck or they decided to go for it because we don't really know what the future is going to be like. I feel like it's kind of unfair because the price that they're paying for the level and quality and opportunities of education that they're going to get during that pandemic isn't going to be worth, the amount that they're spending. They're spending. I mean, it's the truth. It's brutal, but it's the truth. And we say that because we have close people who are enrolled in school, and they can tell they're not getting everything that they wished to get out of being in school. So that's something to know. However, it is December and we just got the question in. So I would say there's two ways to kind of answer this listener. The first one is, what are you going to be missing if you're doing remote learning? Mm-hmm. And the other one is, how could you try and minimize the things that you're missing out from? What can you do, right?
Yeah. And I know, well, briefly, let me reply to the first part of what you said. And my response is that I'd agree. We've talked about this off air quite a bit. And we have to consider the timing of things, right? It looks like, obviously, the rest of this semester, we're now basically December 1st, or it will be early December when this episode comes out. The rest of this semester and all of the next semester will be remote. Yeah, and I agree. If I was a student or soon-to-be student, and I knew that a year in advance, I would have been like, I'm just going to defer and hang out with my parents for a year if I can put up with them.
And I think, I'm going to cut you that, but I think like for a lot of maybe kids who come out of high school and they're excited to start college and like get into their professional track, taking a year off at that kind of hinge in time, it feels scary, right? Because you're missing out potentially, and you're going to be like 1 year older once you start school. But I would say don't worry about that.
Yeah, I mean, you can also think about that year as being very productive. Gap years is something that we talk about on the show. It's come up quite a bit. You had a gap year between high school and the equivalent of college or whatever you call it. And gap years between undergrad and grad school, very productive. And I would highly recommend it for anyone in this profession.
And I feel like if you take it because there is a pandemic, that's a valid reason,
It is a valid reason. I mean, I don't know. Sometimes schools don't allow you to defer, and it would be very sad if schools are changing their policy in this because of this instance, and they're losing money and they're saying you can't defer. That'd be very sad. But so we don't know the particular circumstances of this individual, but let's say you're a person listening and, it is now December and the entire next semester is going to be remote, and it could very well be that a good decision for you is to just stop now and then resume a year from now, depending on all of the factors you have to take into consideration.
Right.
Maybe it's helpful for you to take a year, try and make money with whatever job you do have, support your kids, and et cetera, then you come back to school when you're going to get the most out of it. Like some people, they go to school and it's really important for them to try and squeeze as much out of it as possible because of financial constraints that they have, or because they're paying for it themselves and they're not taking on massive student loans, right? Of course, I'm describing people who have more responsibilities like kids, and they've worked for a while maybe, and they understand what it means to pay this much money for education. And it might make sense for them to be like, I don't want to spend this much money unless I feel like I'm getting the most of it out of it. And right now I'm not. And in that case, I don't see any problems with putting a pause on things. I mean, I think we're going to get into the specific downsides like you mentioned, but, for myself in undergrad, I did take a gap year in a sense. Sort of. Like between fourth and fifth year, I didn't take studio. I was still enrolled as a student, still a full-time student, still took a bunch of classes, but I didn't participate in studio. So on the one hand, by units and courses I took, I was still very much a student. So it's not a gap year. But anyone who in architecture school knows that really studio and being surrounded by your peers who are now your closest friends, that's school. More than anything else, like GEs are almost like not even on the map, in a way. And so that meant for me, after 4 years of being with all these people, I just leave them. I mean, they're still around, but you would be maybe surprised that, listener, you'd be surprised that even though you're on the same campus, same social circles, same building, right? And you might have some classes that overlap. When you're not in studio with these people anymore, the social gap between you and them just grows.
Oh, yeah.
It's the same thing as when you leave an office.
Yeah.
It's like when you would think like, oh, I'm still going to hang out with my friends at the office and stuff because we saw each other for, 50 hours a week or whatever for 5 years and we're still going to be close friends. Sometimes, yes, but a lot of times they belong to this little special world and you've left it. So anyway, I took a sort of a gap year, right? And it was very productive for me, both in terms of things on paper, what I accomplished, but also internally for me to just take a break, sort of, at least a break from the system in a way, right?
And I took a gap year too between high school and architecture school. Basically spending a year in school, but in art school to learn skills and build a portfolio and things like that. So even if you are not enrolled in architecture school right away, there's potentially other things that you can learn and skills that you can develop if you decide to postpone for a year because of the virus. And,
I at the beginning, when I first read this question, the assumption that I made was that, well, this person, they're clearly already enrolled and they're going through classes remotely. They're going to finish out the rest of the year, meaning they're going to do spring semester, right, from January to May or June,
right,
remotely. Now that I think about it more, depending on a lot of other factors, like you could just hit pause now and then circle back in a year.
Policy,
well, yeah, assuming the school allows you to do it.
But
you could
early.
Do that,
Yeah.
Now, because I do agree that the difference between learning in person for an architectural education versus remotely is massive, huge. And there's a couple reasons why I say that. First is like kind of all the obvious things, but also like, we've spoken to some educators on here, and one of them is Mark Navieu, who I've known for a while now, and he's very interested in online learning for architecture, right? He's an incredibly smart person, and he's a good educator. So you think, okay, well, if this guy thinks it's possible, then it's possible. And I'm not going to debate whether or not it's possible on here today, but there's a difference between a school that's done everything in person and then now, in the span of a basically blink of an eye in the history of its existence, has to transfer to this new online platform. There's a big difference between that versus a school that's founded on the idea of doing remote learning, and that's what they do.
Or that has been doing it for 10 years.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Right? It's like right now, the students who, started remote learning in February or are starting it now are kind of, in a way, guinea pigs. Schools are trying things out. They're trying to make it work. They're trying their best, but it's a brand new thing for everyone. So it's like, when you do like a concept car, right? Mm-hmm. You're going to turn it on and see what happens, but you don't really know that shit's going to work the way it's supposed to be. So
yeah, the other thing, so anyone listening that's interested in this conversation, we did a recording with Mark Navieu and two other educators a while ago now called like COVID-19 and architectural education. And they discussed this and they highlight this difference. Like one of them was a dean at a university, and she was told by another faculty member, because they were all talking to each other to try to work through this problem. And he was like, well, first of all, you're not doing what did you call it? Remote learning, as I'm calling it today. You're not doing remote learning. You're just teaching stuff like online. It's not an online, like what he was, the point he was making is like, this is not an online school. You're not doing that. To prepare for that, to do the material, get your people trained and actually have it be an online education requires like, hundreds of thousands of dollars, the training, the time, the people, all the resources. You're not doing that. You're just trying your best to make do with this bridge period. Right. So
the amount of effort and structure and thoughts and everything that's put in place, it's kind of a temporary effort and not a long-term thing in a way. Therefore, and like you said, it's basically, the teachers are trying to do the same thing that they're doing in person, but do it in front of a camera on a laptop with people as little, thumbnails on their screen instead of being in a room. It's not the way of teaching is not necessarily different. It's just the platform is.
And that's there's some things with design education that shouldn't change when you make the transition from physical to digital, virtual, but there are some things that should have to change. And so I suppose now, in a way, the question is, do I continue with this or do I stop and then resume next year? And another thing to consider is the faculty at your school. If it's a young faculty and they're very interested in making the use of tech and they are tech savvy already, if they're young faculty and they're not tech savvy, then I don't know. but they're tech savvy and they're interested and they're invested in figuring out how to make the things work to have the best education, then there's more reason to trust them. But to be honest, there's a lot of old faculty, and they were reluctant at the beginning of all this computer stuff, 15 years ago to begin with. And now remote learning, I know a lot of older faculty
struggles.
They struggle, and they're like, yeah, but I'm not going to bother like investing a bunch of time into relearning stuff because this is a blip again on the timeline of in a way, their teaching career. And maybe they view it as a blip in the timeline of a student's career, but it's not, right? You're talking about 20%, 25%, maybe even more, depending on how long the pandemic lasts. That's not a blip.
I mean, yeah,
that's a
if
huge
you
portion.
Spend a whole year out of your 5 years like this, it's a significant amount of time in your learning path.
And I think students are much more delicate the first year. So, if you feel like you're being surrounded by faculty who they're just trying to survive, which we all are at this point in a certain way. But if you feel like they could be putting more effort in to make this a better education for you, because you only got one shot. As a student, you only have one first year. You don't screw things up. But for teachers, I got lots of first years. Every year I do this for like last 25 years. Not me, obviously, but older generations. And they're like, okay, fine, I do this for a year. I don't need to learn this other program or app or whatever software that's going to be better for the students. I'm just going to do this way because, if you get that sense, then that's more reason for you to be like, well, I'm just going to defer.
Well, that makes sense too, because, the school decided to apply and enroll into, you decided it because of their reputation, because of the classes they were teaching, because of the way the studio was set up, right? You didn't pick it because the way they teach remote learning. So it is something very important to consider. And you're right, first years, they're like those little babies that you kind of need to like manipulate and massage so they kind of get loose and comfortable, and then they can like start walking and running, right? If you don't get this massage, like that's just gonna be rolling around like a blob the whole time. That's not good. No, but
So back to the way you kind of looked at the question is what are the things that you're missing as a first year remote student?
I would say, looking back at my first year, I didn't really, the way my school worked and the way I decided to work in school wasn't really like studio based. So most of the work I would do for my studio was based at home. So the whole like nighttime charrette studio culture, I never really got part of it.
Was that first year, or that was all the years that was the case?
All the years. Because
Really?
the way the school spaces was set up, and also because of my own personality. But I would always remember that my first year was very important to me to make my marks in the school and finding my friends, getting comfortable with the people, with the teacher, feeling like I'm part of a group of babies in the school of thousands of, other students, and feel comfortable knowing, like where is the lab, who's the teacher, what's their reputation. Kind of almost the things that are not about the curriculum, but kind of around it. And in a way, it's like you move into a new apartment with roommates you don't know, or you start a new job, right? You kind of have to like get familiar with things, right? So that year was very important for me for that, I feel like. So I would say that's probably very hard right now for students who started school to have met their classmate on Zoom and try and make friendship out of that. Although that's your generation, right? It's like you're
Sort of.
embedded in technology and FaceTime and iPhone and Instagram and all that stuff. So you're kind of used to that kind of exchange and contact with people. But it's
Different.
It's different. Like we were talking about in one recording, it's like you don't walk by somebody and you start chatting, or you ask like, oh, I like your shoes, where are they from? Or, something to engage conversation. Digitally, everything is very dictated,
Siloed.
Siloed and chosen and calculated almost,
Right.
which is very, very difficult to be spontaneous.
I think for us, it would be interesting to speak with, maybe not quite right now, but within the next few years, talk to a student to see what their experience is like. Because I don't mean just specific to the pandemic. I mean just in general. Because like we're going to be involved with this conference, it looks like, and it's and actually this organization was, from my understanding, founded by students. I think mostly master's level the students, so a bit older, but they're from various parts of the world, and they were actually founded via social media. There's a group that kind of coalesced through social media, and actually, to me, that blows my mind.
Right.
And I don't know if me saying that is something that a lot of listeners would agree with. Like, that is pretty wild that you have an actual organization, like a legit organization, just founded by kind of like random people hooking up on Instagram and DMing each other. I don't know if that blows people's minds, or if they're like, yeah, that's so what, that's what we do,
Yeah.
And this is probably the first time in communicating with this organization, I've actually felt a little bit of an age gap. I'm like, this is weird. You guys, well, also there's some kind of like more just basic
I'm 54.
organization stuff, but it's like, you guys just communicate via DM all the time. This is what you do. You just make a group out of this, but that's what they did. And I would imagine that's obviously more common now in general, but maybe it's not I don't know. It kind of freaks me out. I'm not sure I don't know how people feel about that.
Well, it's weird too, because maybe you're going to make some friends over Zoom and DMs and FaceTimes and things, and then you're going to meet them next year and be like, it kind of smells funny. I don't want to be your friend.
Yeah, look, I mean, there's a dimension to seeing someone in person and that interaction that's just lacking from virtual exchanges at this point via iPads and computers and stuff. And I think a lot of the ideas that, we could just do things remotely, it's become abundantly clear, really, that, okay, there's serious shortcomings to it, and a lot of it is not even more, like quantifiable, I don't know, statistic-based like things. It's just like human stuff. Like, I'm tired of looking at a screen.
Well, I mean, that too, the other thing I feel like is another big one, I think, is getting used to, stand up in front of your classmates and like putting yourself, like speak loud and print stuff and, go to see your teacher if you need something. Like the other aspect of being in school, that's part of your learning. Like I cannot imagine being a second year student, and that's my first in-person studio. Mm-hmm. And I have to go and print out stuff. I have to go pin it out. I have to stand up in front of my classroom and present my project. It's a very different setting.
Yeah. So I think our opinion is that if it makes sense for you and you can do it, I would defer. And the more we're working through this conversation, the more I'm thinking I would probably defer, even just to get next, even if it's one semester. Or I guess you have to defer for a year, but I'd be tempted to do that.
Well, so there is the whole, kind of social aspect, social interaction, getting like the classroom, the audience, like I said, getting your marks in the school, right? But also you can go inside any buildings right now. You can go visit architecture. You can go, see monuments and sketches and see social interaction and how people use this thing. And, you don't have all the tools in your box right now. Right.
Okay, that makes sense. To go back briefly, though, to the whole meeting your friends and, as you said, making your... I don't really know what you mean by when you say making your mark. Do you mean like peeing everywhere to like proclaim your territory?
No, well, I'm trying to find the equivalent in English of the French expression.
What is the French expression?
Oh, having your marks.
Having your marks. Interesting. Well, I get what you're saying.
Of course you do. Just trying to make me sound like a crazy person.
No.
Yeah.
What was I going to say with that? Your mark. Oh, so I think... So you described your undergraduate kind of like how first year was different from others and whatever. For me, and the school I went to, Cal Poly SLO, first year was different in that at that time we had two routes you could go. There was like, I forget what they were called, but there was like ARC 150 series and ARC like 250 series. And in one route, and you just choose a student. In one route, you're doing everything physical in the studio. All the studio production was done physically, hand drawing and stuff only, no computers. And you had a separate computer course to be paired with that. And the 250 route, or whatever it was called, computers were integrated into studio. But anyway, but the other big factor with first year for me was that we didn't have, if I recall correctly, we didn't have permanent desk space. So you just went to studio as a class. It was a studio setting with bigger desks and stuff, but it was still just a classroom. And then you went back to your dorm and did your work at your dorm. And I think they did that intentionally because it is to get all of the first year to kind of commingle at the dorm with each other. It wasn't until second through fifth year that we had permanent desk space. So we got to class, to the studio on day one. You have your seat. You chose your seat or however it's distributed. And that's your spot for the entire quarter. Right. And so if you had to do a year, if I had to go back and choose a year where I was going to do remote learning, I would have done first year because of that reason, right? The studio culture for what I went through was obviously much richer 2 through 5, right? Because we were in there all the time. That's where the relationships really build. First year, you're in the dorms with a bunch of people, yes, but people also live in other places and things. So some of the things that you would want to gain in your first year, if you've done it remotely, are just going to happen your second year. So the social bonds and the things that the people you meet and stuff. Like
you're just putting a little more weight on the second year.
In a way. Yeah.
Right?
I mean, you're not going to learn everything that you would normally learn your first year if you're doing remotely. Some of that stuff is going to be put off to second year just naturally, right? And the other thing too is like maybe there's a concern if you take a gap year, during your education, that you're going to fall behind, or that like you're going to be not just fall behind in terms of your learning. Fall behind in terms of your learning because you're going to have a year off and you're going to forget the stuff you learned, or that you're going to come back and all your friends have moved on and you have to try and like integrate with these different people. And what I would say is, if we're talking about years 1 and 2, don't fucking worry about it, because if you have cold studios and everyone's in there all the time, a complete stranger could come into the studio, and by week 2 of all-nighters, you're best buddies. So that social hurdle of like integrating yourself, let's say, or making new friends, as you all know, it vanishes after like the first all-nighter. All of a sudden, you're all friends, and there's this connection you have. So I wouldn't be so concerned about that, because it's just gonna.
Well, and you're kind of going against the current that everyone's going into.
Right, there's a current, right.
You just have to be comfortable with that. Like I said, some kids might just be like, well, I'm going to be a year older. Everybody's going to be looking at me like I failed. I'm a year behind or whatever. And to that, I would say, who cares? It's your money at the end. It's your learning experience. Yeah. If you're concerned about it, if you want the best, and, that's totally fine. Who cares? Just let them talk,
Yeah, I think you're right. I think for people who go straight from high school to college, it's almost like you don't even think about doing it any other way. That's just what it's going to be.
Yeah.
And most people, meaning that they likely also take on student loans, but that's the stream you're flowing with. And the idea of disrupting it doesn't even come to mind, but there's no problem with it, especially now because it's COVID.
Especially now. You won't be the only one doing it.
If this wasn't COVID, then I would have a slightly different opinion. But it is COVID, so I don't know.
So going back to the question, so the things you're missing out, basically, remote learning is all of your social build-up, interaction, friendship, and all of that. Some of the actual learning experience in a way by being able to visit places with teachers maybe, or even just on your own, like experiencing architecture and learning how to look and feel and understand space when you can't go anywhere. It's a little restricted.
Yeah. So if you're going to stay in school, right, and you're not going to take a year off or a semester off or whatever, then there are things you can do to kind of help the situation. The first is that I'm going to assume that for most educators and students, like the times that they meet with their class, there's probably set times when they all meet as a class, and there's set times when they meet for individual desk crits.
Right.
To bring your work, and it's just a one-on-one.
Right. And
I'm going to assume that the one-on-one desk crits, that the schedule of that's much more flexible. I know it's going to be for me at least this upcoming January. I'm going to have an X number of students, and obviously we have times where the entire class comes together, and that's going to be much more rigid. But between that but when I have individual meetings with them, I can do whatever I want. It's whatever works for me and them, especially because some of them are even in the States at this point.
Right.
But I would say that because everyone's doing things remotely, that in a way teachers are now more accessible than before, which means that what I'm saying is, if you're a student, don't think that you have to be limited to the official hours to see the teacher. To make up for the fact that you're not meeting in person, if I were a student, I'd be contacting my teacher way more often, be like, hey, you got like 10 minutes, like, can we chat real quick? And it'll probably end up being like 20 minutes, but throwing that stuff in there.
That's a very good point, actually. It's almost like you have a personal trainer.
Yeah, exactly.
That's not on call, but, that's probably, if you were going to meet them in person once a week, right, they'll probably be like, hey, just wait until like we see each other next week to ask me this stuff. Don't email me, don't text me, whatever, right? But now this relationship is much closer it's kind of paradoxal, right? Because physically it's much more distant, but in the way things actually function are much more streamlined and immediate, right? So I think that's a good way to look at it, is that they're almost like a personal trainer. Ask them as much stuff as you want. Yeah. They are there and available for you.
Yeah. And so we kind of have to push the boundaries of informality. It's the same thing as Instagram DMs are powerful to get in contact with strangers, and you can send at any moment, any time, and everyone's on Instagram. It's a similar thing. Like, there's no reason to wait until whatever day to ask a question. You can just shoot them a question right now on your phone, The other thing I would say is, like, you should just tell your teacher the students, what you think works best and what you want to happen.
Being vocal. Yep.
Like, I was in a meeting with some other faculty, and we were thinking, like, okay, how do we do this? Like, how should we approach this? And like, my first response is, why don't we just ask the students? Because the students that we're going to have are older, and they've already been through 2 quarters of remote learning. They already know what it feels like to be a student during this. We don't really. Right.
Yeah. They
know what works. They know the technologies that are available and how things flow, right? So we should just ask them, what things do you like from the last 2 quarters? What things do you not like? That's probably actually the fastest way to get to a good point for everybody. Because if you're a student and you've done 2 quarters of this, the nuances of remote learning, you're very much familiar with at this point.
Yeah, and if you're not, again, they're learning as much as you are on that topic. So it's a team effort. They're trying to give you the best, and if it doesn't work on your end, well, you got to let them know. And that's actually, pretty amazing that you can give them feedbacks about the way they teach remotely, because in person, it's really difficult to tell your teacher, like the way you run the studio or the way you do this doesn't really work for everyone. The hierarchy and the things you have to go through to get to that point in person is much more complicated in a way. It's not as shareable, maybe. So I would say just get as much as you can from this whole thing.
I mean, it comes down to your reading of your school, which is harder to do when you're remote, because it's your vision of the school is limited to whatever you see on a screen.
Right.
When you're in school at a person, you get a sense of like the vibe of the place and the different players and the people, because you're surrounded 360 degrees by all of this information. The casual passing by, okay, that person dresses a certain way, is probably going to have these certain views. Obviously, that's a shallow way to make a decision, but there's all this information coming through in various levels. When you do things remotely, that's not the case. 99% of that information is filtered out. And the 1% you do see is very, very, strained also. Strained meaning filtered. So it might actually be a good idea, if you don't feel like the school's doing enough for you to try and make this as best as possible, to see if you can somehow get in contact with older classmates who've been doing this for maybe a semester longer than you have.
The year before you
and they've
did,
also been through X amount of quarters or semesters of school, and be like, hey, do you have any tips of like how to handle myself, or things that, both things for yourself as an individual and things for the teacher to do, right?
That's a very good point. I was just thinking about that when you were talking about people, passing by in the hallway. I'm like, when you're in school, you're a freshman, you walk around and you see studio for 4th year, 5th year. You kind of get a pick of what they do. You can chit chat with them. If you're on Zoom, what are your chances to talk to these people or meet them, right? But I think you're right. If you're a student who just started school now, well, guess what? There were students the year right before you, right, that went through that whole thing. So, yeah, get in touch with them. Yeah. See, who was good, even just the second year of this year. Ask them how their first year went and what did they feel like they got and they didn't get, right? And that could also be very helpful because it's an insight from inside.
Yeah. I mean, even going to upperclassman reviews was always something, at least at the school I went to. Like, reviews kind of happen at the same time, and you're walking around, you can pop in and out of different reviews. Like, I would, if the school doesn't encourage that already, I would figure out a way to do that. Even though it's remote and it's not the same, still helpful to see a 4th year review, to see the different faculty members at your school, to see how the students present and what's presenting. It's all information that you might typically get, right? But you're not. So you might have to go out and seek it if the school isn't doing that already.
Another thing that could be helpful, if you have some kind of mentor from like an older year than you.
Yeah.
You know, that's always very helpful. I remember when I was in school, there was a couple girls that were a year older, and like my friend and I would like help them work on their thesis projects, you know, like make little models and things. Well, maybe it could be digital stuff, helping them out and learn things. Or you have questions, you ask them, they know, they went through it, right?
No, that's a really, really good point. That's a really good point.
And it's not because the school doesn't have a mentor-mentee program in that you can't just go on the school forums website and pop a question and be like, hey, I'm looking for a mentor, someone that could help me out, I can help them out, you know? I'm sure there is a place for students to reach out to each other on the school platform. If there isn't, just make a group, make a Facebook group, make something to invite people in, right?
Yeah, I think the mentorship idea is really great. And if I were designing a class now for first years, that's probably something I would do on the first day. It's like everyone find a mentor. And, you know, you can't put too much pressure on the mentorship program because you know, you can't expect a fifth or fourth year student to be a great educator, a life coach, and a true leader, and all the things that a teacher needs to be. But if you can just talk to them half an hour once a week, even, you know, that'd be helpful. Or again, informal communication. That's the other thing too. Going back to the informality of communicating, that's been very helpful in schools and even in offices. So, like. You know, so let's say there's setting a conference, setting a meeting in a conference room, obviously an office setting. That's like one level of something, right? Then having a quick sidebar conversation that's in a conference room, but you just schedule it right beforehand. That's different. Calling someone is one thing, emailing is one thing, and then shooting a text is another thing, right? And even in offices, like you communicating to other people within the office, a lot of times there's like a what do you call it?
Slack channel.
Like Slack is a program. I don't know if students know about Slack, but Slack is
I'm sure they know about it.
Okay, well, Slack is basically like what? It's like
it's a little software that you create an account on it, and you can. If you work in an office, like each project with project manager and the team could be on it, so you have questions. Like as you work, something comes up, you don't have to go from your desk to your project manager and have a whole team meeting. You just pop the question in, somebody jumps in, or you just have like friends or direct direction one-on-one with people. You can also like share documents and all kinds of other features. Yeah.
So we had in one of the offices, I think we had that, but I remember using Google Chat because the email was via Google. And of course, it was used for project stuff, but not project stuff. And it was actually really important in terms of the social culture of the office and how we all felt like we were excited to come to the office to do the work, but also we get to hang out with our friends because we're chatting via GChat and the boss thinks that we're working.
Great, David.
Yeah. I hid behind a column. And they kept sliding my computer further away from the column because I wanted things to be aligned. I'm like, no, I want to be next to the column.
It's difficult when you use Slack in a physical environment with your peers around because if you talk shit about one of them, you gotta be careful nobody sees it.
So it's funny because on the one hand, it's like, well, okay, but what does that kind of communication, the gossipy stuff, what value does that bring? It actually brings a lot of value, not just to the spirit of the people, but probably to the work itself.
Yeah.
So another idea that came up recently in working with some people is like is having a working session where everyone's on a Zoom meeting, and there's no purpose to the meeting other than that everyone's working at the same time to kind of recreate the studio space. I'm not super sold on it. I think it could be a mess. But like, for example, if you have 8 people and they're all working, but you have the Slack channel open on your screen and it's in the bottom right or whatever, you're recreating the fluidity of communication, but the downside is you're not in person, but the plus side is you can control that threshold a lot greater.
Yeah.
You're not forced to listen to some shitty music that some guy's playing in the corner of the studio. But that guy's there to contribute to the conversation to kind of keep your spirits going.
Yeah.
So I think finding informal ways for everyone to communicate is very, very important at this point. And I think also a lot of students are doing this already, but if you're not, you could make it more formal, an actual thing, and say to the teacher, hey, I think that what we should do is set up a Slack group or whatever it's called for the entire class, like just for the students, and then one also with the teacher, because you don't want the teacher always to be there. And, it's... if you don't have that, you should have that. I mean, that's become common, but also very powerful. And if if that is not there, it would be kind of a bummer.
And so Slack is actually pretty great because you could have different types of. It's not Zoom, like you don't have to have the video on all the time. You don't have to have an ID. You just log in with your login and passwords. Just have to be careful which channel you post things in because you don't want to. Send an inappropriate image to the group of the teacher, maybe.
Take a look at this.
But it's cool because if you're working on your computer for your project or whatever you're working on, it's like always there. So the window, you just pop in, say something, somebody answers, someone who's there can answer. You don't have to text. You don't have to make it into a formal email. I think it could work pretty well.
It's kind of strange when you think about it because so much of architectural education, you think of it as being, you're working at your desk, but there's people around you and they're doing the same kind of work, and then you're looking at them, or they're looking at you, or looking at each other's work. And the other aspect is that there's desk crits, and so it's a little bit like if the teachers have the technology to recreate a drawing board in front of them. So usually at a desk grid, you have your drawings, let's say. Let's just talk about drawing for a moment. And then you have trace, and you sketch over the trace, and then you talk to the students about it, and you're sketching back and forth, and they keep the trace, right? You can recreate that digitally with Concept Board, I believe it's called. I forget now. I'm confused between the programs. Concept Board, which is something that I think all the schools are using now. We're going to be using it in January. And if your school doesn't use it, I would pitch it to them because it's basically a blank space where you can recreate. It's a blank space where you can throw stuff on there, whatever fashion you want, and lay things out like a big table, right? As opposed to being like a Zoom call where you have to do a share screen. So I don't know. The question I had was, well, if you have Concept Board, which is replicating the trace paper in a pretty good way, and you have decent internet, I'm like, what's the difference at that point?
Well, you don't get the perception of the quality of the thing, or if you make physical models or things, like your understanding of it is much more limited. I don't know.
I think also the understanding of each other as people is much more limited. Yeah, and that's actually probably the models are difficult, right? But that's also maybe the biggest issue is that the teacher doesn't get to read you as a human being, assuming the teacher even cares about that, which a lot of teachers don't focus enough on that, I believe. But they don't get to read you, and you don't get to read them.
Body language and all of that
Body
out the
language,
window.
Yeah, all of those things are super important to understanding the mindset of so from a teacher's perspective, the mindset of a student. And as I said in the previous recording, like when I go to do any kind of crit, especially a desk crit, I spend a lot of time just staring at the student.
Yeah. Well, that, and also I feel like I lost my thought.
I was talking about if
that, and also I feel like students are probably a little less attentive on the computer. Like even the other people who, like if you're doing a desk crit, right, you're talking about your project in front of the class, but mostly with the teacher and other students are there and listening. A lot of them are probably doing other things because there is no one watching them, telling them to put down their phone or not chat with their mom or not trim their nails or whatever they're doing at the same time. So,
right.
The like how much of you is actually present when you are on those meetings, and how much of you is actually willing to engage in those things, I think is much lower.
Well, so I want to reply to that in a moment. On the communication side of things, I think maybe when you're in person, a student can be kind of shy and quiet. And so there's a lot of information that's being kind of tacitly exchanged between people. Body language is a big part of it, right? But I think now, because things are being filtered through really crappy 480p Zoom quality or whatever, that as a student, you have to be much more proactive in asking questions and saying how you feel, right? I think you should always be that way anyway. Right. And the students that learn the most, the employees that learn the most and do the best are the ones who are always asking, and they just put everything out on the table. But that's not everyone's personality. In human interaction, you can get away with that a little bit because the teacher's going to see you, but that's not the case now. So kind of more tacit or implicit things need to be made explicit. Right?
Because the teacher is going to miss it.
They're going to miss it. They're not going to see it. And especially if you're doing some older person and they're trying to figure out how to use Zoom and they're looking at the wrong thing or looking at themselves when they talk, because a lot of people do that. Like whatever feelings you have, you need to voice it and not allow anything for interpretation. Be open to not allow anything to be tacitly communicated.
And I think in that it's mostly like basically if you struggle and you needed some sort of help to help you go through the project or whatever you're going through in studio, the signs are going to be much less visible. That's what we're talking about, right? So,
yep. Yes.
So if you need help, if you need assistance, if there's something you don't get, text that teacher, ask for a personal meeting if that's something that you don't feel comfortable doing in front of everybody. But don't wait for the teacher to see the signal because they're probably not going to be able to.
I have to say that as a teacher, one of the more difficult things is to get a reading on a studio, to know how everyone's doing, right? To see how a person, because I have a responsibility to understand each student as an individual, but understand how the entire studio is doing, because both are important, right? And getting a sense, and the same thing as a boss, like how are the employees actually doing? Really more difficult as a boss in a way because there's money involved, right? And the power dynamics are different. But from teacher to students, I spend a lot of time trying to figure out, like, how can I get a better reading of them? And that's why I'm a very big fan of doing, what do you call it? Exit interviews or mid-exit interviews. Basically, you just take, I think I've talked about this before, but you use a one-on-one session with a student, him and I, her and I, or whatever. We go to a different space that's not in the studio, and it's a space with just the two of us, and we just have a conversation. And obviously, I have questions about how they're doing and whatever, but it's a conversation. It's not me giving feedback and spewing out stuff, and it's not them telling me. It's a back and forth, and it's a chance to drop the shoulders again, as we talked about before on previous recordings, and have an exchange. And that's a very important thing for me to do, because that's a great way for me to get a reading of them. And if I do that across 18 students, a reading of the studio, because they spend a lot of time on their own and with each other that I don't know about, right? So I think translated to now learning remotely is even more important for faculty members to be having these one-on-one. We're not talking about projects. I mean, we can talk about your project, but this is not desperate. Let's just have a conversation, because there tends to be an assumption that when we meet to talk about your project, that we're going to talk about your project. I mean, obviously that makes sense, but given the social challenges that we're all facing, there's a lot of other stuff that's equally important to whether or not that informs whether or not a person is learning successfully. And you need to, so what I'm saying is, in the physical world, you kind of can not formalize that part of the education, but now you cannot afford to just assume it's going to happen.
Yeah.
You have to structure, you have to say it's going to happen and set aside a time. And if you feel like your teachers aren't doing that, then fucking tell them. Be like, hey, can we just have like a 15-minute chat once a week or tomorrow or whatever, just to kind of, because I have some questions about, for you and whatever. Because I'm sure they're willing to help you with whatever problems you have, including just like social, again, stress, isolation, and whatever else is happening. The other thing, like you were saying, the engagement that people have when they're on a Zoom call.
Yeah, I mean, I've been on Zoom stuff, and it's really hard to be interested in watching someone or listening to something if the person's struggling and talking or explaining, or the video is crappy, the sound is awful. It's hard. It's really hard. It's
hard. I think there's also one way to combat that as the number of people involved in the Zoom meeting. So if you have a full class group discussion type of thing, and there's 16 to 24 students, and you're all talking about something, really easy for someone to kind of become disengaged. Easier for them to do that in person already. Like, say you get together in studio and you're talking about a reading that was done. There's always one or two in the back kind of doing nothing or trying to be on their phone and whatnot. Much more challenging, even more challenging on Zoom, obviously. So I think coming together as a whole class is important, but you have to recognize that there are only certain times that that's going to be really productive. On the other end, so typically studios are kind of taught where you have that setting and then you have the one-on-one desk crit setting, right? And I think that probably the best and most productive meetings happen when there's maybe 4 people at max. That's the teacher and 3 students, or the teacher and 2 students. Sometimes it depends on the student. Sometimes you need 2 students for it to be there. Sometimes 2 students is enough, and sometimes you need 3 to kind of get things mixed up more. So when would I meet with just 3 students? Basically for everything, except for the private conversations and except for the times where I feel like we need to be as a whole class. And you mix up the students that you have the meetings with. So every week or whatever, to different phases with each other. And that's a small enough crowd where everyone has to be focused and engaged. So let's say a desk crit. I wouldn't do, even in a normal studio setting for underclassmen, I would almost never do a desk crit one-on-one, if I can avoid it. Right. It's the boba. So I would do desk crits with groups of students and not an individual, because it's still too isolating.
It's too isolated. But about the attention, I think, if you are one of the students and you kind of lose interest after 10 minutes in for like all of those meetings, either that they're the whole class or like smaller groups, you should think about your classmates. Mm-hmm. And the fact that if you're not participating, if you're not giving feedbacks, if you're not asking them questions, they are also not getting very good education and they're not getting anything from you. And it's very unfair. And if you want people to be engaged when you're talking and you get as much as you can about your project, just think about that and try and be out there. So nobody's asking a question, then just ask something, right? Yeah. Because if you start doing it and other people will start doing it too, and then at least you're minimizing again the loss of doing the remote learning, right? Like everyone just like get the hell out there and like start participating and make this fun and productive for everyone. Because yes, it is painful and uncomfortable and annoying and we don't enjoy it. But if you go with that spirit, that mindset in, it's not going to be good. Mm-hmm. It's not going to be productive. The outcome is not going to be the best one you could have got, right? Yeah. So try and think about that and be the person who switches things up a little bit, The
other thing that you can do is it might be worthwhile, and as a student and also as a teacher, to kind of like mandate that after you meet up as a group of 4 for a desk crit, I as a teacher leave, and the 3 of you have to stay on for another 15 minutes, 10 minutes, or some short amount of time and have a conversation just between the 3 of you about anything you want. It could be about the stuff that I said and the fact that it made no sense and you're confused, or that you disagree with things that I said between each other, or that you just want to talk about anything. Because I think, we always talk about on here that there's like the meeting or the review itself, and then there's an afterwards time when you need to kind of translate that information or filter it or digest and comprehend that information. And I would think that it's if you're working only on your own, right, and you have a meeting with a teacher who's very, very high level advanced compared to you, and the communication between teacher and students always difficult because of that gap, right? A lot of times, if I could somehow ensure that a student always understood exactly what I'm saying and they truly understood it to their core, then that would be amazing. But that's never going to be the case because the knowledge gap is too big. I'm going to say stuff, and it takes time for them to think about it and to try and integrate into their work and whatnot. But so what I'm saying is that if I have a meeting with a student remotely, and then they go back, and now their meeting's ended, and they're now transported back to the physical world on their own with whoever else, and they're missing that kind of way to digest information, which typically would actually happen in the studio physical setting with your classmates. You would talk about the thing that the teacher just said to you, or you could talk about anything else, but there's this kind of, letting the stew simmer or something afterwards, right? So I think actually once you have the group desk crit, because I do think it should be a group, just spend 10 minutes amongst yourself talking literally about anything will really help that information actually that meeting become productive, you know.
That's a good point.
I mean, for me, some of the most helpful conversations as direct in terms of design, but also just, again, making friends and stuff is, okay, I had a desk crit. Let's all go and walk to the, you know, whatever place on campus and get a coffee or, I don't know, whatever it was.
And about that, you know, for the more like friendship, you know, contact, making friends, get to know each other or talk about things outside of studio. I don't know, like every week you could have one person who organize a happy hour, Zoom meeting, game night, you know, with whoever wants to join, right? And you make that person a different person every week so people feel like they're involved, right? They're actively participating, because I think there's a lot of students who just kind of like follow whatever is being done but don't really participate. So that's one way to do it.
Yeah.
You know, you can play like game on your phone online. They have all kinds of apps and things you could do. You could do karaoke. You could, you know, like Scrabble. I mean, you know, like, I don't know, right? You could come up with games and things outside of studio and make it a weekly routine or every 2-week routine, right? To make sure that you kind of get that going.
Yeah.
And you gotta, that's the problem too with remote working or remote learning, is that the days and time and schedule and limits of what is school time versus what is personal time is very loose. Mm-hmm. And you don't want to feel like you're in school every day. You don't want to be, you know, working on your stuff every day. You also need breaks. Right. You need to get your mind out of your projects. You need to get your mind out of studio stuff. Because it's never good when you're just like stuck in one thing. You know, imagine food in a bag for a week, weeks and weeks and weeks. Well, it starts rotting, right? Well, your brain is the same thing. You gotta let it air out. You gotta let it, you know, get some sunlight.
Well, this gets you know, more generally, I think you have to force structure on yourself to make things, to keep sane. And this is something we've also talked about on here, because we've left offices and started our own practice. And then we have no responsibilities to anyone other than ourselves now. And the lack of structure, you know, is significant. We have to invent our own. We wake up, we could, I mean, there's the issues of finances, of course, but we could wake up whenever we want. We could not work. We could choose to exercise, not exercise. We could eat whatever. It doesn't matter. We could do whatever we want, right? And that amount of freedom can be very difficult for a lot of people. And you have to kind of recognize yourself as from a distance and say, okay, I'm a being, and you need to see yourself from an aerial view, from a God's view, and be like, okay, I need to create myself some structure, and then I'm going to take my own decisions out of it. I'm going to force myself to go through the structure, because otherwise I'm going to go nuts. And I think that's also very important.
And it's probably especially hard for, first-year students in college, because they left the structure of maybe being at home, going to high school, and having their parents kind of run their day or their week schedule in a way, right? Yeah. To be on their own, potentially, being maybe not even living with their parents anymore. So, and you don't have that physical structure that is a campus and classrooms and you know, the schedule is very sparse now.
Yeah, I would try really hard to schedule a lot of stuff weekly, and have it be a set schedule. And it's I mean, like every week on Wednesday at 2 p.m. from 2 to 3, we have this meeting, right? And it could even be as extreme as, again, I think we have to be very aware of the fact that when you meet as a class of all 16 students in person, you're not actually meeting as 16 people. I mean, you are, and there's times when everyone kind of coalesces as a group of that big, but even when you're in the same room, it's groups of like 3 or 4, basically, always. Maybe a group of 2, and there's one straggler, but everyone's in groups of 3 or 4, even if it's a meeting of 50 people, right? And I think it's important that we all realize that that's the case. And when you throw everyone into a Zoom meeting, you're not allowing that in-betweenness of everyone being in kind of groups of 3 or 4. I mean, you can chat privately between people on Zoom and probably do groups, but it's still that fluidity is not there, and everyone either has to be on stage or off stage. You're either in the back of the room because you're one of 16 tiny thumbnails, right? That probably don't even fit on a single, oh yeah, I think that would fit on a Zoom screen. But, you're on the second page of Zoom grid, right? So you're either way in the back of the audience or you're on stage. And for educators especially, you got to recognize that that's not healthy. It's not productive. It's weird. It's unnatural. So I don't know. I'm even more and more a fan of the 4-person max.
I think that makes sense.
Situation.
It makes sense.
And it's funny in groups of friends and stuff when you go hang out. It's kind of cool to be the one that's. You don't plan things. You just kind of go with the flow and whatnot. And there's always a scheduler, like the Monica of the group, right? And that's not cool to be the Monica. But of course, I think if you're a little more mature, you realize past a certain number of people, you need a fucking Monica to schedule stuff.
So get your Monica.
Yeah,
Find who's your Monica.
We all need to be Monicas now. Really, because during one of the times I was out of the country, I was part of this program, and there was 25 or maybe 40 people, a lot of people, and we would schedule things on our own. There's no elected leader, right? You have a group of 20 to 30-year-olds, 40 of them, and we're all going to go do this trip or go to this town or whatever. We didn't have a director in charge of us. How the fuck do you do that? That's really difficult to do. Well, we had a Monica. In this case, her name, we'll call her Monica. And, there's some kind of teasing going on with her and behind her back for other reasons too, but also she's so over the top, aggressive control freak. But if we didn't have her, nothing would have happened. Yeah. Right. All the fun that you have is because someone else structured it for you and you're allowed to push up against those rules or go along with the flow. So I think now, as I said, we all need to take more control of our lives, especially the students. And you need to do that.
And to stay sane, I think, you gotta get a good sleep schedule on. You gotta make sure you eat at normal times. Basic stuff, it sounds really rudimentary, but, when you're kind of lost in what you're supposed to do and how things are going and you're unsure, there's so much uncertainty. Well, at least get the shit together about the things that are certain. You need to sleep, you need to eat, you need to exercise, you need to feel good, you need some playtime, you need some work time. Basic stuff. Yeah. If you got those at least in order, I think that will help you be the best of yourself and get the most out of it.
If I had complete control over a class, I would be very militant about it. I would schedule everything because I think people, you feel unproductive and lost when you don't have a sense of direction or order.
Yeah.
There are plenty of people who work in offices, partners and stuff, or project managers, and they just run around from meeting to meeting to meeting, right? And you kind of wonder, what, in a sense, their lives are very abstract because they're always moving. So how is it that they manage to stay sane and not feel like they're lost? It's because everything's super structured.
Of course. Well, and if you have design studios, those are the times where you need to you can get lost a little bit, right? You don't want to get lost on everything in your life right now. You can only get lost in one thing.
Yeah.
The other thing is, about not being able to visit architecture, go inside buildings. Well, you could still go outside of buildings, and see them. And I think, trying to stay safe and wear a mask and, however you get to that building, be as careful as you can because, we don't want to encourage bad behavior. But you could still look at buildings from outside. You could still, sketch buildings. You can make it a challenge. You can make it every week. I have to go and look at a building and understand it and know it. See what makes it what it is, what's around it, how to understand it. Even if it's not an assignment that a teacher is giving you, just for yourself to kind of get some fresh air, look at things, trying to understand it. Because you won't get the chance to go with your class and your studio to look at those things and have your teacher talk about it.
Yeah.
But at least, do your part, right? I think that's something that's possible.
I'd be curious to know for the students out there what other specific things that you are struggling with now, like this individual said, we're assuming they were first year because they said, I'm brand new to architecture and this has been really difficult. just ask a buttload of questions. Just ask a ton of questions from the teacher and different sources if you can, and be hyper structured. That's really probably the only thing I can think of that would be significant in terms of helping. I don't know.
I mean, and read books, listen to podcasts, watch documentaries on Netflix and YouTube, or you know what I mean, like try and get architecture however way you can.
Well, yeah. I mean, the thing is also when you're a first year, you're just even in person, you're going to be confused, right? It's like first year is hyper confusing for students because it's the first time that, well, this is a whole different podcast now, but they show up with preconceptions. They have to try and shed those preconceptions. It's the first time that they're asked to do something. They have no idea how to do it, and you just do it. You figure it out and you do it. And we're going to talk about it. And it's an entirely new way of thinking, new way of speaking and problem solving, new skills. There's a lot of stuff happening. So to some degree, like, you're going to feel lost no matter what you do. You're not really supposed to know what you're doing. I think if you knew what you're doing, then either you shouldn't be in first year or you're doing it wrong, all first year students that I've come across, they're very confused. Most of them, because you're making abstract things and somehow that has meaning, and you have to look at it and understand what the meaning is and why it's good or bad. Like very, very weird stuff to be doing, really, because everywhere else in your life you're told what's good or bad, and there's this a value system that exists, and there's based on numbers or what people tell you or whatever. But now you're thrown into blank space, and you're making stuff out of raw material. Typically, you're drawing out of on a blank page, and it's a different language. So yeah, it's going to be difficult. So anyway, I hope it was helpful, the things we said.
Look, I hope it was helpful. If anyone, maybe a student who was in school in first year in February of 2020, have some tips that they want to share with this listener who reached out to us, well, reach out to us, 213-222-6950, and either we put you in touch or share the info. If you have any other feedbacks, any questions, feel free to ask. We're here for you guys. Yeah,
and the person that wrote in, thanks for the message. If there is anything specific that that we can address, it tends to be specific questions get better answers, then that would work as well too. If you like what we're doing, then leave us a review. That's actually a great way to support us, right?
The best Christmas gift you could ever give us is a great review on Apple Podcast.
Yep.
Not the Apple Store.
Apple Podcast. And we're also on Spotify and YouTube on occasion. And you can connect with us via any of the social medias.
Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And of course, the hotline, one more time, 213-222-6950.
All right, everybody. Stay sane, stay safe, and stay productive.
Yep.
Right? Talk soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.